I vividly recall my first encounter with Heather. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and we were both attending a charity gala hosted by Doug. My presence was due to my profession in investment banking, but Heather instantly captivated my attention. Her infectious laughter resonated throughout the venue, drawing me towards her like a moth to a flame. We spent the entire evening engrossed in conversation, exchanging anecdotes, and forging a connection that surpassed my expectations. From that initial moment, I sensed a unique spark between us, something precious worth nurturing. As time progressed, Heather and I became inseparable, our relationship blossoming. After 4 years together, I felt incredibly fortunate. She was more than just my romantic partner. She was my confidant, my closest friend. We experienced our share of challenges, as any couple does, but the positive experiences consistently overshadowed the negative ones. Therefore, when Doug extended an invitation to his New Year's Eve celebration at his mansion, I was delighted. It presented the ideal opportunity to commemorate not only the holiday, but also the life we had built together. I pressed the doorbell and stepped back, anticipating Doug's arrival. While we waited, I drew Heather close for a brief embrace, kissing her tenderly. My love for her was immeasurable. The past 4 years had been the happiest of my life, and tonight we were poised to celebrate in grand fashion, surrounded by friends at Doug's extravagant New Year's Eve party. I was eager to see Doug, but even more so, I was looking forward to spending the evening and night with my wife as we ushered in the new year. Just as I was about to ring the doorbell again, Doug greeted us with a wide smile, enthusiastically welcoming us inside. Judging by the numerous cars parked outside, I anticipated a large gathering, yet I was still taken aback by the sheer number of people congregated within his residence. Doug embraced Heather warmly, kissing her cheek before ushering her inside. He then turned to me, shook my hand, and stepped aside to allow my entrance. A maid accepted our coats, vanishing with them into the crowd. Doug walked between us and said, "Gosh, I'm glad to see you both. I detest when my parties become this crowded, but I feel obligated to invite everyone. The majority are business associates, but the few genuine friends like you two are the ones I truly value having here. Clarissa is around somewhere, probably avoiding the usual handsy guests," he added with a chuckle. As the evening progressed, Heather and I danced, ate, and indulged in more drinks than we perhaps should have. However, we were unconcerned, knowing we had accommodations upstairs. We were among the select few invited to stay overnight, eliminating any worries about driving, securing a taxi, or designating a driver. My investment career was thriving. I was, in fact, one of the top brokers in my office, and held a high ranking within the company. Consequently, I recognized many of the attendees, and frankly, a significant number were unattached women, or worse, as Doug and I concurred. Heather, with her striking beauty, had to deflect unwanted attention, much like Doug's wife, Clarissa. Throughout the evening, I seized opportunities to network, conversing with existing clients and engaging with affluent guests to cultivate potential new business. However, I also kept a watchful eye on Heather. I trusted her implicitly, but I wouldn't deny a tinge of jealousy. I observed her closely and occasionally intervened when a man became overly familiar. In these situations, Heather would typically offer a gentle smile and kiss, often whispering, "Thank you," or "Thanks for saving me, honey." Tonight was no exception. Several times I noticed her attempting to disengage from someone who had encroached upon her personal space. Each time I received a smile, a touch, or a kiss, accompanied by her soft expression of gratitude. We would chat briefly, perhaps share a quick dance or a drink, and then part ways once more. As the night wore on, many guests departed, leaving only those who were staying to welcome the new year with our host. That's when I noticed a particular man who seemed to be shadowing Heather, almost to the point of stalking. He remained within close proximity, constantly observing her. I recognized the look in his eyes. He was completely enamored with her, seizing every opportunity to remain near. Initially, Heather ignored him or moved away, but as the night progressed, she engaged with him for longer periods, even smiling and laughing at his remarks. Occasionally, she would lightly touch his arm. This was uncharacteristic of my Heather. She never flirted in such a manner, especially not with a stranger. Doug must have noticed as well, because just before midnight, he approached me. "Stan," Doug began quietly, "the guy with Heather is Jonathan Douglas. He's bad news, a real player. I didn't invite him. One of the women brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood beside me, carefully surveying the room. A curious expression crossed his face as he continued. "Actually, I think his girlfriend already left. Now that I think about it, earlier in the evening, she watched him follow Heather for a bit. Then they had a rather heated exchange. I haven't seen her since. Stan, he's trouble," Doug warned. "Trouble with a capital T. He's married, but they're separated more often than not. He pursues married women, or anyone with something he desires. He's attracted to married ladies and wealthy single women, even though he's worth millions himself. You need to keep an eye on him. He could charm a nun into bed and convince her it was her own idea." For the third time that night, I intervened to separate Heather from Jonathan. He gave me the same smug look as before, but this time, Heather didn't express gratitude. Instead, she appeared irritated and said, "Stan, what's with you tonight? You saw I was enjoying my conversation with Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to interrupt? He's not like the usual creeps you've saved me from. He's actually interesting." I vividly remember the day I first encountered Heather. It was a crisp autumn afternoon at a charity event hosted by Doug. My invitation stemmed from my work in investments, but Heather immediately captivated my attention. Her laughter resonated, drawing me in. We spent the evening engrossed in conversation, sharing stories and connecting unexpectedly. From that moment, I knew there was something special between us. As time passed, Heather and I became inseparable. Our relationship thrived, and after 4 years, I felt incredibly fortunate. She was more than just my partner. She was my confidant, my best friend. We navigated the usual relationship challenges, but the positive times always prevailed. So, when Doug invited us to his New Year's Eve party at his mansion, I was elated. It was the perfect opportunity to celebrate our life together. I rang the doorbell, stepping back to wait for Doug. I pulled Heather close for a hug and a soft kiss. My love for her was profound. These past 4 years had been the pinnacle of happiness, and tonight we would celebrate in style, surrounded by friends. Just as I was about to ring again, Doug opened the door with a grin, ushering us in. The number of cars parked outside hinted at a large gathering, but the sheer volume of people inside his house still surprised me. Doug hugged Heather tightly, kissed her cheek, and then welcomed me with a handshake. "God, I'm glad to see you both. I hate it when my parties get this crowded, but I feel obligated to invite everyone. Most are business contacts, but the real reason is for good friends like you two. Clarissa's around here somewhere, probably avoiding the usual handsy crowd," he added with a chuckle. As the night unfolded, Heather and I danced, ate, and perhaps overindulged in the open bar. We were unconcerned, knowing we had a room upstairs. We were among the few guests invited to stay the night, eliminating any worries about driving. My investment career was flourishing. I was a top broker in my office and highly ranked within the company. I recognized many attendees, a significant number of whom were, to be blunt, available women. Doug and I shared a similar sentiment. Our beautiful wives, Heather and Clarissa, had to fend off unwanted advances throughout the evening. I took the opportunity to network, chatting with clients and potential prospects. However, I kept a close eye on Heather. I trusted her completely, but I admit to a touch of jealousy. I watched her closely and occasionally intervened when a man got too close. Heather would always respond with a smile and a gentle kiss, whispering her thanks. Tonight was no different. Several times, I rescued her from overly attentive men, each time receiving a smile, a touch, or a kiss, and a soft, "thank you." We'd chat briefly, share a dance or a drink, and then go our separate ways again. As the night progressed, many guests departed, leaving only those staying for the New Year's countdown. That's when I noticed a particular man shadowing Heather, almost stalking her. He never strayed far, his eyes fixed on her. I recognized the look of infatuation. At first, Heather ignored him or moved away, but as the night wore on, she engaged with him longer, smiling and laughing. She even lightly touched his arm. This was unlike my Heather. She never flirted with strangers. Doug must have noticed too, because he approached me just before midnight. "Stan," he said quietly, "the guy with Heather is Jonathan Douglas. He's bad news, a real player. I didn't invite him. One of the women brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug scanned the room, a curious look on his face. "Actually, I think his girlfriend already left. Earlier, she watched him follow Heather. Then they had a heated conversation. I haven't seen her since." "Stan, he's a problem," Doug warned. "He preys on married women or anyone he wants. He's attracted to them even though he's wealthy himself. You need to watch him. He's incredibly charming and manipulative." For the third time that night, I went to retrieve Heather from Jonathan. He gave me the same smug look, but Heather didn't thank me. She looked frustrated. "Stan, what's with you tonight? You saw I was enjoying my conversation with Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to interrupt? He's not like the other men. He's actually interesting. And he has hilarious stories. He's running for mayor and was telling me about the people he deals with on his campaign. When he found out I work in public information and advertising, he asked for advice on getting his message to voters. I think he might offer me a job." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Honey, I don't care," I said firmly. "I don't trust that guy, and I don't like him around you. Doug says he's bad news and a womanizer. I've heard things too, and I want you to stay safe. The job he's hinting at will probably have you working nonstop." Heather glared at me, her anger evident. I worried I'd ruined everything, but then she smiled, leaned in, and kissed me. "This is cute. You're jealous." But then she said, "Don't worry, honey. You're all mine." As we parted to mingle, something bothered me. She'd said I was hers, but she hadn't said she was mine. That thought lingered, and 3 months later, I would recall that night in painful detail. The last 2 months at home had been difficult. Soon after the party, Heather started coming home late from meetings or visits with her parents. When questioned, she became angry and defensive, claiming she lost track of time or had to finish something. She also started volunteering for the local Republican Party after work, which consumed even more of her time. Heather was a highly skilled department leader, almost legendary in her abilities. She quickly became the volunteer office manager for the local campaign, organizing the chaos and gaining popularity. Like many oblivious husbands, I noticed our sex life dwindling as she spent more time away. I faced more rejections, and when we did have sex, it was perfunctory. She treated it like an obligation, a stark contrast to the passionate intimacy we once shared. She always had an excuse: too tired, too late, not enough time. The truth was, she used to be a willing and enthusiastic participant, but now it felt like a chore. One day, I confided in Doug about my marital problems. He gave me a worried look. "Stan, I'm starting to think I might have played a role in your problems. I've been hearing rumors that Jonathan is involved with another married woman. Word is, he met her at a New Year's party, and we both know where he was and who he spent that night with. She's also volunteering for his mayoral campaign." I felt lightheaded. Doug looked at me concerned. "Stan, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared at him and replied, "Heather started volunteering at the Republican office too, about an hour after work and on Saturdays. She always comes home late and refuses to talk about it. Every time I ask, she gets defensive or angry. When she's home, she snaps if I get too close, and she's almost violent if I try to see her undressed or initiate anything physical." Doug leaned back, pursing his lips. After a pause, he said, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on. And well, let's just say I won't let him get away with it. If he's been abusing my hospitality by messing with my best friend's wife, I'd be angry if he'd hooked up with any married woman at my party. But your wife? That's crossing a line. I should have kicked him out when his girlfriend left, but I was too busy playing host. If I'm the cause of your problems, I promise to make it right." I should probably explain a bit more about Doug. He's my best friend, and I trust him implicitly. Honestly, I'd trust him alone with my wife, even if they both hadn't had sex in a year. He'd never betray me. We're closer than brothers. Doug is brilliant, probably the smartest person I know. We were in the same high school class. He was valedictorian, while I barely cracked the top 10 in our class of 223. He only attended college for a year before deciding it was a waste of time. He rarely went to class, never studied, but still maintained a 4.0 GPA. He ended up taking just a few finance courses before becoming a self-taught investing and finance guru. The reason he delved into finance was an inheritance of a little over $70,000 from his grandparents during his freshman year. Unlike most young people, Doug didn't squander the money. He bought a decent used truck and invested the rest in the stock market. His first 2 stock purchases were based on a broker's advice. Unsurprisingly, they were trendy picks that generated profit for the broker. That infuriated Doug, and he embarked on a self-education journey. He watched CNBC, devoured books, and immersed himself in market research. Eventually, he opened a discount brokerage account online, transferred his funds, and began trading independently. From his first solo trade, Doug earned more than he ever did with the so-called experts. It helped that he started in the late 80s during the tech boom. He strategically traded lucrative stocks, not always profitably, but he grew his wealth exponentially. He was also astute enough to shift into safer stocks when the market began to decline. He bought Berkshire Hathaway shares at just over $1,770 and sold them 3 years later for $2,357 a share. By then, he was a multimillionaire, expanding into venture capital and real estate. I graduated from college and spent 4 years working as a salesman for a restaurant chain. I didn't enjoy the travel, and I was serious about Heather, so I transitioned into becoming a stockbroker. I managed a small portion of Doug's millions. He'd entrusted me with some of his investments when I was starting out, and I always suspected it was primarily to help a friend. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing he didn't need my advice or management. It felt like charity. But Doug convinced me otherwise. His reasoning was twofold. He wanted to diversify his investments across different brokerage firms for security, and he believed I might encounter valuable information that could benefit him. Neither of us ever considered it insider trading, but occasionally I stumbled upon something useful, and we both profited. Doug also referred many of his friends and acquaintances to me, generating commissions from those trades. Doug was self-employed, working 8 to 10 hours a day, researching stocks, and managing his investments. He lived comfortably and often included Heather and me in his social circle. We attended countless charity events with him, often at his expense. Occasionally, I'd cover the costs, utilizing my expense account. Doug and I also attended political meetings and socialized with influential figures. We never missed a Friday night gathering at Doug's house. After our conversation, Doug and I planned to attend a $500 a plate political rally with him and his girlfriend. For some reason, Heather was more reluctant than usual to accompany us. I insisted, and I still regret it. Our marriage was already on shaky ground, especially after Doug's investigators gave me their report on Heather, but that dinner marked the true beginning of the end. Upon arrival, I realized it was a reception for a state Senate candidate supporting other state and local politicians. The ticket price benefited the state Republican Party, with a portion also going to local campaigns. What I hadn't realized was that the guest of honor was a mayoral candidate for our city, Jonathan, the same a-hole from Doug's party. As we entered, I saw Jonathan at the front, smiling and chatting with local dignitaries. I felt Heather pull away slightly. Turning to see what was wrong, I found her staring at Jonathan, her face radiant, like a woman in love. In that moment, I feared I'd lost my wife. "What's wrong?" I asked. Heather snapped out of it, offering a weak smile. "Sorry, dear. I just didn't realize who this dinner was for." She looked so guilty that I doubted her, but I kept quiet. She had to have known Jonathan would be there, considering her part-time work at his campaign office. It now made sense why she'd been hesitant to come. I glanced at Doug and saw he'd noticed our exchange. He glared at Jonathan before plastering on a smile and guiding Heather to a chair. He pulled it out for her and seated Clarissa next to him. As I walked by, Doug called out, "Sorry, Stan. I didn't realize he was part of the group benefiting from our generosity." After finishing her meal, Heather excused herself to use the restroom. As she stood, Jonathan also got up and left through a different door. I hesitated, considering following him, but Doug placed a hand on my shoulder. "No, Stan. It's already being handled. And if it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday, please." Later that evening, I lost track of Heather again and went searching. Returning from the restroom, I slipped onto the stage and hid behind the curtain. I heard soft moans and hushed voices, one unmistakably Heather's. Anger surged through me, and I moved towards the voices, but tripped over a rope, making a noise. "Oh no, someone's coming. I need to leave, honey. It won't help if we get caught. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick kiss, and then hurried footsteps moving away. I followed, but was too late to see anything, just assuming it was Heather and Jonathan. As I walked back, I encountered Doug in the hallway, his face dark with anger. He grabbed me. "Damn it, Stan. I told you to leave it alone. We need to gather information before you do something rash. If she is cheating, and I think she is, we need proof. That way you can get the best possible outcome in a divorce. The way you're acting, you're only going to get screwed over by the legal system." After calming me down, Doug continued. "I saw them rushing down the other corridor. They stopped at a classroom door and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were looking for them. Now she's even more suspicious, and it'll be harder to get the truth." When we returned to the table, we feigned nonchalance, making sure Heather and others saw us laughing and sharing a pocket flask. As I sat beside her, Heather shot me a look. "Where were you just then?" Clarissa walked over to Doug, hugged him, and smiled at us. "Okay, you two. Next time I catch you sneaking out to your car for a drink, I'll either join you or call the cops. Now let me have a sip of that flask." Heather seemed to relax a bit. She turned to Clarissa. "Oh my God, what were they up to? I couldn't find them earlier." Clarissa laughed. "Oh yeah, I tried to catch them for my share before they went inside, but as you can see, they beat me to it." Later. That night, during a dance with Clarissa, she seemed lost in the moment. When I attempted to scan the room, she gently stopped me, refusing to follow my lead. She kissed my cheek and said, "No, Stan, you don't want to look right now. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. But remember, Doug and I are here for you, always." I relaxed slightly and returned the kiss, whispering, "Thanks for stepping in earlier. I nearly lost it. Doug thinks that would have been a big mistake. I'm so angry at this guy. I don't know what to do." The rest of the week and weekend were agonizing. I oscillated between fear and rage. Deep down, I knew Heather had emotionally detached from me, and it was only a matter of time before she physically left too. We hadn't been happy for weeks. I started distancing myself from her mentally, even though I wasn't certain if she had actually cheated. But even if she hadn't, something was seriously wrong. We were no longer the loving couple we once were. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I had a strong suspicion his friend was a private investigator. I was a nervous wreck, my stomach in knots, battling heartburn. Beneath the surface, my anger simmered, and I knew Doug and his friend could sense it. I both dreaded and craved the truth. As I approached their table, Doug stood, shook my hand, and pulled me into a hug. After the greeting, he introduced me to his friend, Simon Hobbs, who, as I suspected, was an investigator. We took a moment to peruse the menus and place our orders. Doug then said, "Let's get this unpleasant business out of the way." He looked at Simon, then back at me. Simon opened his briefcase, retrieved a large envelope, and handed it to me. "We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas per Mr. Beaver's request. The surveillance lasted 20 days, ending last Saturday night." He continued, "During that time, we observed them having lunch together daily, except Sundays, when she stayed home. They dined at various upscale hotels, and after each meal, they retired to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we gained access to the room by posing as room service. Each time neither was dressed, and the bed was clearly in use. Photos and reports are included. We also recorded audio by placing a microphone under the door. They had sex during every hotel visit. Simon paused, then added, "Additionally, we recorded multiple inappropriate encounters at the campaign office and after hours. We have photographs of them engaging in sexual acts, 3 times at the headquarters, and once at a party with some of Mr. Douglas's supporters." He hesitated. "Perhaps the worst incident we captured involved a meeting between Mr. Douglas, your wife, and Stephen Nagano, the president of the Municipal Employees Union, at a gentleman's club. Nagano seemed quite taken with your wife, and we have photos of her sitting on his lap with his hand under her dress." Simon placed a laptop on the table and played a segment of a DVD. "You'll receive a copy of this in the report, but I wanted to review this specific incident first. My operative was eager to share this information, and I believe your lawyer will be too." Doug and I leaned in to watch. In the video, Heather sat between Jonathan and Stephen. The 2 men leaned over her talking, while Jonathan's hands roamed. He touched Heather's breasts and slid his hand under her skirt. At one point, Heather whispered for him to stop, but he responded, "Heather, I can feel how excited you are. You know you like this. Just relax. It's nothing unusual at this club." Jonathan then kissed her softly. She moaned, pressing herself against him as his hand continued moving under her very short skirt. From the camera angle, it was clear she wasn't wearing underwear. After Jonathan leaned back, Stephen pulled her onto his lap. She tried to resist, but he persisted, sliding his hand under her dress and unbuttoning her top to kiss her breasts. Heather hissed, "Stop it, Stephen." Stephen then looked at Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, you know what needs to be done if you want the union's support. I want to spend the weekend with her. If you arrange that, I'll make sure the union backs your campaign." Heather, clearly distressed, tried to get up, insisting, "No, this is not happening. Let me go." Ignoring her, Stephen raised his eyebrows at Jonathan while continuing to touch her. Jonathan swallowed hard and leaned toward Heather. "Honey, we really need this. Just go with him and help me out. It'll secure our future. And it's not like you haven't done this before. Just tell your idiot husband you have a meeting this weekend." In the video, Heather looked shocked and initially resisted, but then seemed to relax. She moaned and turned towards Jonathan, kissing him. At that moment, the club manager approached their table, looking nervous. He glanced at Heather, then at the men, and stammered, "Mr. Nagano, I've overlooked a lot for you, but you're becoming too obvious. Lieutenant Jones said the chief sent detectives to the club to reduce incidents like this. If they see what's happening, they'll shut me down. Could you take this to a back room or a hotel, please? This is my livelihood." Stephen laughed and looked at one of the large men sitting across the table. "Hey, Ralph, why don't you give Joe a couple $1,000 for his trouble?" The usual DoubleTree cover story for a union leaders meeting was in place for the weekend. But inside, my rage simmered, threatening to erupt. "That liar," I seethed. "She wasn't at the DoubleTree last weekend. The San Francisco disaster relief assignment she'd fed me Friday night was a blatant fabrication." Doug and Simon intervened, pulling me back down as I surged to my feet. Simon's voice was calm. "Sir, please, one more clip before you read the report. We have suggestions, but the footage should be seen first." He detailed how his operative, upon leaving the club, had preemptively sent reinforcements to the DoubleTree. After Stanley's security detail checked him in and retired to the bar, operatives posing as hotel staff shadowed them to the suite. While the thugs swept the room, the team subtly altered the placement of pillows, flowers, and other decorative elements, maintaining the pretense of room preparation. A faint smile played on Simon's lips. One of the senior managers even dispatched an assistant for fresh flowers and champagne, providing our operatives the perfect opportunity to install concealed cameras and microphones throughout the suite, including both bedrooms. "By the time your wife and Stanley returned," Simon continued, "they were inebriated. The cameras documented everything. He initiated playback on his laptop. The video revealed Heather and Stanley entering, closing the door behind them. Stanley instantly moved in for a kiss, then with a guttural sound, ripped open Heather's blouse, sending buttons flying. He tore it from her as she unzipped her skirt, letting it drop to the floor. Completely nude underneath, she stepped out of her shoes and, giggling, took Stanley's hand, leading him into the master suite with its king-sized bed. The video showed her undressing him and pushing him back onto the bed. A few minutes later, another man entered the frame. Stanley looked up and smiled. It was the city services director. The recording documented Heather engaging in sexual acts with both of them. Simon stopped the video, his gaze meeting mine. Your wife stayed in that room until Monday morning checkout. She engaged in sexual activity with Stanley and all the senior managers of the Municipal Employees Union. Jonathan Douglas himself paid a visit Saturday night, spending most of the night with her, Stanley, and the city services director. He went on, we have further photographic and video evidence, including recordings of their discussions about misappropriating city funds for Jonathan's mayoral campaign. We also possess evidence of Senator Newsom and 2 judges engaging in sexual acts with your wife and Jonathan. Jonathan bartered her sexual favors for political endorsements. It's all documented. He paused. At the campaign dinner where you attempted to expose them, Jonathan and your wife intended to engage in a sexual act on stage. He'd already pulled her dress down and removed her underwear. He was about to commence when she heard you, and they bolted. We have photos of that too. It's probably for the best you didn't create a scene. The photos would have been detrimental. He handed me the complete report. We can furnish this to your attorney. Our fee encompasses local court testimony. I also suggest ongoing surveillance for potential criminal indictments. Providing the FBI and local authorities with evidence of campaign finance abuse and conspiracy will significantly increase the likelihood of prosecution. Furthermore, should you pursue a divorce, this evidence will bolster your case for a favorable settlement. Even with a degree of foreknowledge, the wave of revulsion and shock was potent. The depth of Heather's depravity and disrespect was staggering. The report confirmed her proclaimed love for Jonathan and their ongoing discussions about leaving me, complete with the promise of a position in his future administration. The most jarring revelation was her willingness to engage in acts at the DoubleTree that she'd consistently refused with me. She even initiated these acts during their private moments later that weekend. I'd always known Heather's ambition and her fascination with powerful men, but the extent of her willingness to compromise for advancement was beyond comprehension. Nausea churned in my stomach. I could barely eat. I noticed Doug's appetite was similarly affected. After Simon departed, Doug and I sat in silence, the weight of the revelation heavy between us. Finally, Doug spoke, his voice filled with remorse. Stanley, I am so incredibly sorry. I've ruined your marriage. I take full responsibility, and I'm committed to making it right. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I will help you in any way possible. I'll find you a top-notch divorce attorney and support you every step of the way. I rose from the table and looked at Doug. Let's start with finding that lawyer. I had been prepared to give Heather an ultimatum, change her ways or we divorce, even before I had definitive proof of her infidelity. But now, after witnessing this, I couldn't fathom it. Had she changed, or had I simply never truly known her? As for the rest, we both knew Heather's betrayal wasn't Doug's fault. He owed me nothing. On Thursday, Doug called. Stan, I found you a legal shark. She despises cheaters and champions the wronged spouse. She loathes powerful men exploiting women. Played right, you'll not only keep most of your assets, but we can also crush Jonathan. He provided the lawyer's contact information. I called that afternoon. Her assistant seemed to anticipate my call, scheduling a 9:00 a.m. meeting the next day, along with a list of required documents. The next morning, I was promptly ushered into her office. Sally, my new lawyer, impressed me immediately. We quickly delved into my objectives. I want to dissolve the marriage and retain all our property, though I realize that's unlikely. I also want to go after that wife-stealing bastard for everything he's worth, ruin his mayoral campaign and leave him destitute. Sally leaned back, rocking slightly. Then, a smile. Are you sure you just want to go all out? Or do you want to financially ruin him, destroy his reputation, and potentially send him to prison? With the right maneuvers, incarceration is a real possibility. I've reviewed portions of the investigator's report, and it's damning. Frankly, this case is so egregious, we could take down most of the key players. I'm legally obligated to submit the report to the authorities. They've violated multiple federal laws. Going to the authorities before filing for divorce will hit him harder. Filing first might give him a chance to escape consequences. I don't care what happens to him or the others who slept with Heather, I replied. As painful as this is, Heather bears the ultimate responsibility. But she couldn't have done it without him. From their first meeting, he pursued her relentlessly until she succumbed. It takes two to tango. She always wore her ring. He knew she was married. I even heard them on tape discussing her stupid husband and plotting how to handle me during the breakup. Solidifying my resolve, I instructed Sally to prepare and file immediately. We agreed to submit the investigator's report to the FBI at once, triggering an investigation into campaign finance violations and the misuse of union and city funds. Sally suggested I engage a process server for Heather and threatened legal action against Jonathan Douglas. Be warned, she cautioned. If he's a typical politician, he may threaten you with physical harm, attempt to get you fired, or even file a countersuit. He might also try to negotiate secretly and offer a bribe. If that happens, depending on the source of the funds, we could hit him with additional campaign finance violations. Politicians often misappropriate campaign funds for personal use. Sally then produced a tiny microphone and recorder. Keep these with you constantly. Wear the microphone concealed in your hair and keep the recorder in your car. The transmitter's range is about 1 kilometer, but the recorder stores up to 6 hours of audio and automatically downloads when back in range. She took my car keys. I'll have someone install a dash cam while we finish up here. She also advised, consider retaining a private investigator or allow me to hire one to continue monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've heard rumors he's used these tactics before, employing illegal methods to cover his tracks. Catching him discussing his plans or attempting to manipulate the situation will be invaluable. I smiled. The PI I hired gave me similar advice. He's still on retainer. The following Thursday, Sally called. Mr. Malone, we're ready to file and serve your wife. Do you still want to be present for the serving? Absolutely. At least I'll get some satisfaction from that. I paused, then suggested, what about serving her tomorrow night at campaign headquarters? Wouldn't that be opportune? Sally considered. No, Stan. Serving her there and creating a scene will immediately alert everyone, and word will spread rapidly. Jonathan might lose the election, but he won't feel pressured to bribe or negotiate. It's better to serve her when she's alone, or with him, ideally alone. Okay, I see your point. How about we follow them tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't get home until midnight on Fridays, and the report indicated they often spend Friday nights alone in a hotel room, usually the same one they use for lunch trysts. Could we have room service deliver the papers and catch them in the act? Sally agreed to hire a process server to interrupt their Friday night rendezvous. When I arrived at my office the next day, 2 men in suits were waiting. They introduced themselves, inquiring about my management of funds for their widowed mother. I smiled, inviting them in. Once the door closed, FBI badges flashed. They were working on Jonathan's case, based on my lawyer's submission. Learning about the process server and my intent to record the interaction, they requested I wear their device. This made me uneasy, given my thoughts of leveraging the situation for personal gain, but I couldn't justify refusal. I agreed to wear their wire as well. That evening, we trailed the lovebirds from campaign headquarters to their hotel. They arrived around 7:30 p.m. Our numbers felt conspicuous, like a parade, and I worried about exposure. We waited nearly an hour. I'd brought my camera, anticipating the need for documentation. Not usually one for home movies, this occasion warranted an exception. Just as we prepared to knock, a stroke of luck. The elevator doors opened, revealing a room service waiter pushing a laden cart. He glanced at us questioningly. Smiling, I gestured towards the door. Go ahead, be our guest. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll just step aside. The waiter smiled back, unfazed. He knocked. Jonathan asked who it was. Room service, came the reply. The door opened, and the waiter entered. The process server and I remained concealed. As the waiter exited, I blocked the door, allowing us to slip in unnoticed. We waited until Jonathan and Heather began their meal before revealing ourselves. I led the way. The scene that greeted me was both shocking and heartbreaking. Despite the detective's report, the reality was far more devastating. Heather and Jonathan were completely naked, seated at the table, their meal spread before them. Appetizers, dessert, wine. Heather sat on Jonathan's lap, her back to him, feeding him and engaging in sexual activity simultaneously. They seemed utterly oblivious, lost in their own world, kissing tenderly. I started filming as we rounded the corner. I nodded to the process server. He stepped forward. "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather shrieked, leaping off Jonathan's lap and scrambling for a robe. Jonathan cursed, rising angrily. "Yeah, I'm Jonathan. Get the hell out of my room. How did you even get in here?" "The room service waiter let us in," the process server calmly replied. "Didn't you hear us ask if we could enter? I thought you invited us." He advanced, handing Heather the divorce papers. "You've been served." I stepped forward. Heather finally noticed me. "Stan, damn you! What are you doing here? And what's this divorce nonsense? Stop this or I'll ruin you. You'll have nothing." "No, Heather," I said calmly. "You won't. In fact, if you're smart, you'll sign these papers and accept my terms. When I'm finished with you, I'll deal with your lover. I'm suing him for mental cruelty and alienation of affection. Fortunately, we live in a state where those suits are still viable. This will also damage his election prospects. To be blunt, you've been played. Now face the consequences." Heather didn't go home that night. I didn't hear from her until the following Wednesday. She called me at work, skipping apologies or pleasantries. "Jonathan and I want to meet to settle this mess. We've booked a conference room at the hotel tonight. Be there at 7:00. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. I informed Sally and my FBI contact. Sally insisted I attend. Both she and the FBI would provide backup. At the hotel, I inquired about the meeting. A receptionist directed me to a small conference room, guarded by a large man. He stopped me. "Private meeting, sir." "I know," I replied. "I'm Stan Malone. I'm supposed to be here." After checking my ID, he knocked. The door opened a crack. "Mr. Malone is here, sir." The response was inaudible. The door closed. The guard turned back to me. "I need to search you, sir. Empty your pockets into this tray." I complied, and he patted me down. Irritated, I asked why. He smirked. "Political figures attract assassins, sir. Mr. Douglas isn't taking any chances." I suspected they were searching for recording devices but didn't argue. Fortunately, I'd adhered tiny transmitters to my scalp, concealed by my hair. After a 5-minute wait, they finally admitted me. Heather sat at the table, her gaze fixed on me. Guilt was evident in her flushed face and chest. When Heather shifted, I realized she wasn't wearing underwear. Glancing at Jonathan, I almost lost it. His eyes gleamed with a smug grin, clearly relishing having just slept with my wife. The meeting unfolded predictably. Jonathan began with threats of job termination, escalating to physical harm unless I offered Heather a better deal and dropped the lawsuits. I leaned back, calmly stating, "You and your cronies might be able to harm or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken precautions. If anything happens to me or my family, even an accident, certain packages will be delivered automatically. You know some media can't be controlled. They'll publish, especially if I'm harmed. You'll be finished." Jonathan's face flushed with anger. Heather's familiar tension signaled her fury. Smiling, I continued, "I know exactly what you were doing before I walked in, and I have photos of you doing it before. Photos and recordings from last week's meeting with union leaders and city officials at the hotel. Do you think they'll appreciate being dragged into this? If anything happens to me, the information being mailed will expose all of you. Some of these people, let's just say you don't want to cross them." Heather glared while Jonathan, looking slightly ill, struggled to maintain composure. "You heard me," he snapped. "End this quietly, or else." "You know, Jonathan," I said, leaning forward, "I might reconsider if I were confident in a fair divorce settlement for my wife." I paused. "But if this town's idiots elect you, they'll get what they deserve." I stood, maintaining eye contact until Jonathan squirmed, visibly struggling not to look away. Chuckling softly, I turned towards the door. Glancing back, I added, "Oh, and Jonathan, things are about to get very uncomfortable for you." I left without waiting for a response. My private investigator and the FBI agent were waiting in my driveway. After removing the microphones and packing up, the investigator grinned. "We got it all. After you left, Jonathan ordered surveillance on you, digging for dirt. You rattled him." 3 days later, I met with Sally. "I'm done waiting. I told Jonathan and Heather my terms. They're still stonewalling. Let's get aggressive. File the lawsuit. $10 million. Sally paused. "Let's do it. That'll get his attention and make headlines." As I left Sally's office, I noticed one of Jonathan's thugs tailing me. He stopped, grabbed his phone, and started gesturing wildly while talking. He'd overheard. That evening, Jonathan called, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Listen, idiot," he began, feigning calm. "Heather and I discussed the meeting. We'll give you some of what you want. She'll sign the divorce papers as is and walk away with only her personal belongings. She'll also resign. I'm willing to settle. A voluntary agreement if you promise to keep quiet." I laughed. "Jonathan, I can promise I won't leak anything. I can't control others. Hundreds probably already know you're sleeping with my wife." A tense silence followed. Then, frustrated, "Fine. 1 million? No questions asked. If you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Heather will deliver the signed divorce papers with your terms." I shook my head. "Jonathan, I just instructed my lawyer to file a $10 million lawsuit. 1 million won't make me drop it. I could probably make more from book and movie deals." Jonathan cursed. "Okay, 1.7 million. Final offer. I'll find a way to bury it in the campaign accounts." "All right, Jonathan, but move fast. I won't stop my lawyer until I see the money. Here's a Cayman Islands account number." I omitted that the account was in his name, using his address, hoping federal investigators would trace the campaign funds. I planned to transfer the money immediately upon receipt. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. The same guard from the meeting stood there, holding a clipboard with a one-page legal document. "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for your signature." I glanced at it, smirking. "Looks fine, but my lawyer needs to review it." He frowned. "I shouldn't leave without it." I sighed and closed the door. In my office, I called Sally, explaining the situation. She agreed to come over. An hour later, after reviewing the document, she smiled and told me to sign. 3 days later, $1.7 million appeared in the Cayman Islands account. That same day, Sally informed me the uncontested divorce papers were signed, filed, and would be finalized in 30 days. I immediately transferred the money, routing it through various banks under a fictitious name, anticipating Jonathan might try to reclaim it. My work suffered. Commissions plummeted. I struggled to focus. Colleagues often covered for me, earning commissions on my clients' sales. Even after the divorce finalized, I remained distracted, making costly errors. The fear of retaliation from Jonathan or his associates lingered. One night the doorbell rang after 9 p.m. Heather stood there crying, a fresh bruise on her face. "Stan," she whispered, "can I talk to you?" I hesitated before letting her in, leading her to my office. She sat, weeping. Finally, she spoke. "Stan, I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize. I made a huge mistake. Jonathan manipulated me. I fell for him, and the job he promised. The election. It made me lose sight of us." Her sobs intensified. "I was so angry with you on New Year's Eve. I was already late when you pulled me away from him. He'd convinced me to sleep with him less than 3 hours after we met. I'm so sorry." Her voice trembled as she described how, after weeks of sneaking around, she'd become convinced she had to fully support Jonathan. He'd promised to leave his wife and marry her after the election, claiming it would hurt his campaign to do it sooner. She'd become entangled in the fantasy of being the mayor's wife, perhaps even a senator's or governor's, losing touch with reality. That evening, she'd found Jonathan with a young campaign volunteer. "You were right, Stan," she said bitterly. "He fed her the same lies. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, 'What makes you think I'd marry an old whore like you, especially one with a history of cheating?'" She angrily wiped her tears. "He said if I behaved, I could stay on as his social secretary. entertaining his important friends, like before. Sobbing, she continued, I slapped him, and he punched me. He's ruined everything, Stan. I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize. If you can forgive me, I'd love to try again. She gave me a hopeful, regretful look, kissed my cheek, and left. I watched her car speed away, sighing, wishing she'd realized this before everything imploded. The memories in the house were too painful. I listed it, hiring an agent to find a new place, somewhere free of the past. I hired movers and a cleaning crew. I occasionally contacted Doug or Sally for updates. The feds had taken over the investigation, suspecting local police corruption. They agreed to keep my name out of it unless absolutely necessary. Sally reassured me they had sufficient evidence to honor that agreement. About 6 weeks later, I awoke to news of mass arrests in Jonathan's scheme. Charges included corruption, campaign violations, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misusing funds and selling promises of future appointments. Unsurprisingly, Heather was also arrested for her involvement. I called Sally. The leaks hadn't come from me. Everything was falling into place. The money was safe. I smiled, remembering how I'd carefully planted incriminating documents while searching for Heather. After speaking with Sally, I sat back, finally at peace. I had my revenge, freedom from my unfaithful wife, and $1.7 million for a fresh start. I was free to build a new life, find someone truly worthy, and maybe even start a family.